My name is Tom Erb. I am the National Field Organizer on the Put a Price on It campaign, and the name of this panel is Human Rights in Development, with a possible focus on migrations and climate change and climate refugees. We'll see where the conversation takes us. I'm joined here currently by Siobhan McInerney-Lankford, and hopefully later we'll be joined by Charles De Leyva. We'll see about that. But I wanted to start by thanking you for being here today. It is my pleasure to introduce one of our world's top international human rights lawyers, and we're going to have a specific focus on climate change. Just so you guys know the format of the panel, we're going to start with a short introduction, possibly a presentation talking about some of the work that Siobhan's been doing for several years now, go into a moderated discussion where I'll ask several questions related to international human rights, the connections to climate change, and then we'll move into an audience session where all of you can ask, hopefully, lots of engaging conversations. So just to introduce Siobhan, she is Senior Counsel at the World Bank Legal Vice Presidency and a recognized expert in international human rights law, advising the World Bank in this area since 2002. She has published widely on human rights law and is the co-editor of a forthcoming book on human rights methodology. Additionally, she is an adjunct professor at AU Washington College of Law. Thank you for being here, and I'll now turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here and to share some reflections on this important theme of human rights and climate change. I work primarily, at least in this sphere, on human rights and development, but will like to share some thoughts on that connection, so human rights and development, through the lens of climate change, which, as you know, is the theme of this year's Law Week. The reflections today are also coming from a research project which Charles De Leyva and I began at least in 2008, which resulted in a study in 2011, which I actually have here a couple of copies, but I know it's available online. It's called Human Rights and Climate Change. And that began as what's called a TFESSD, so a trust-funded research project, in two parts, and I think it'd be useful to talk a little bit about that research project and then get into the substance of what we actually, what it yielded, so what were the conclusions. The study was done in two parts. The first part was an international law study with the aim of consolidating legal knowledge on the connections between climate change and human rights. So as many of you will know, here in the bank, there's been a significant amount of work done on the social and human impacts of climate change. And this is subtle in one sense. Our study was about the human rights impacts of climate change. And it really tried to answer the question of what difference does it make to characterize something as a human rights problem. So clearly there were human and social impacts, which were very well understood, very well documented. But what did it mean to characterize this in terms of human rights? So I'll get to that in a moment. The study then was aimed at really providing a comprehensive literature review of the connections between human rights and climate change, and how the frameworks that govern human rights on the one hand and climate and environment on the other hand interact with one another. It was not it doesn't argue for any particular legal or political outcome, and it's not advocacy based in any way, nor is it connected with any bank project in particular. That was complemented then, this macro, sort of the law between states, the study on the law between states was complemented by a micro study which we undertook in the Republic of Marshall Islands about 2 years later. And the purpose there was to explore how the insights of the international law study might play out at the domestic level. Specifically, we were looking at human rights impacts on the right to health, the right to housing, and questions around discrimination and disparate impact. You know, were certain groups more affected or disproportionately affected by climate change than others, and if so, why, and so on. So I think it's important, though, to notice that, or to recognize that a study on connecting climate change and human rights has actually quite a long history, a pedigree in something else, which is efforts, academic and other, to link human rights and the environment. There's a General Assembly resolution that dates back to 1968, the title of which is Problems of the Human Environment, which notes the links between the impairment of the environment on the one hand and enjoyment of human rights on the other. That was followed, or 2 decades later, or a little bit less than 2 decades later, you see the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, which I still think is the only human rights treaty to specifically recognize a right to a satisfactory environment. After which, of course, during the 1990s, you have the Rio Declaration and Agenda 21, which make this connection in very explicit terms. Obviously, during the same period of time, important work has been published by people like Dinah Shelton, explaining exactly how and why human rights and environment are linked. So to fast forward a little bit and go then to the specific question of the link between human rights and climate change, those efforts, I think, are probably located in the past 10 years. They don't really go earlier than that. Very significant there is the 2005 Inuit petition before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, the 2007 Malay Declaration, which was spearheaded by small island states that were feeling the impacts, or are feeling the impacts, of climate change in a very real way. And then a total of 5 UN Human Rights Council resolutions dating from 2008 until 2015, and I think we can probably expect more. I think a very significant analytical piece, in addition to our own, of course, was the Office of the High Commissioner's study in 2009 on human rights and climate change, which did not state that climate change was a violation of human rights, but explained in very clear and elaborate terms the ways in which climate change affects the enjoyment of human rights. And finally, I think worthy of note within the human rights system, the UN human rights system, is the appointment of an independent expert on environment and human rights. That's John Knox, whose term, I believe, has been renewed and whose work is very widely recognized as pushing the boundaries, but also creating, I think, a very solid analytical base for policy recommendations in this field. I have just a couple of insights I'd like to share that came from the study, and then I'll be glad to answer your questions or anybody else's. In terms of what we took from this research, in terms of sort of the key insights, I think there are probably 3. The first was that climate change may impact the enjoyment of human rights. This is obvious, but it's particularly apparent in respect of a number of economic and social rights: the right to health, the right to water, right to housing, the right to education. The second is that human rights obligations themselves may be relevant to responses to climate change, so a sort of more proactive or prospective view of the connection. I think this is especially true, or especially important, with respect to procedural rights, which I can get to later, and also important to the promotion of climate resilience, making communities better able to face and confront the impacts of climate change. And those may be relevant to both mitigation or adaptation. A third point that came from this research was that measures to address climate change may themselves impact the realization of human rights. So we have to think reflexively and critically about what we do to combat climate change, since those actions may unwittingly result in negative human rights consequences. They may not be human rights neutral, or they may even be negative in terms of their impacts on human rights. And then just a final thought, if I may. One of the questions that we struggled with a lot and that we pushed our consultants on was, what is the significance of characterizing something as a human rights issue? What are we adding here? What's the value added, dare I say? Which is a favorite term, a favorite question, of course, in the bank, where we tend to look at problems or look at things in more instrumental terms. I think this was important because this is already a fraught area, very complicated area, and we were, I think, rightly challenged about what bringing a human rights lens would add, other than further controversy and political division and sensitivity. I think it's fair to say that obviously, as I said earlier, that climate change would have implications for the enjoyment of rights that are protected by law. It's an important thing to recognize. These are not rights that are just invented or floating out there. They are already the subject of legal protection at both the domestic level and the international level. The second, and I think this is a crucial one because it raises the justice and fairness arguments, some ethical issues, and that is that the impacts of climate change are borne disproportionately by those who are already vulnerable. So and more than likely will increase their vulnerability. And the final point, I promise, is that the impacts of climate change are also borne by those least likely to have contributed to the problem, whether between countries or even within countries. So let me stop there and answer any further questions. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you. That's quite an impressive and extensive study. And I just wanted to go and build on some of the things you mentioned generally. So as someone who doesn't have a background in law or international human rights, I'm curious, when you talk about how climate change threatens these rights, which ones do you specifically work on, or which ones do you see are more predominant compared to others?
Okay, well, I think looking at it at the micro level, which we did in Marshall Islands, the ones that I mentioned are still the usual candidates. So it will be the right to health, and they're also all interconnected. So it's unlikely that you'll have a very severe impact on housing that won't affect health and education, for instance. So there was, I would say, health, housing, water, education. I think what our analysis also revealed, which is a common human rights issue, or something that would be common in human rights analysis, was the discrimination dimension. So it wasn't just that these economic and social rights were, and cultural rights, by the way, were also impacted, but that they were likely to be impacted more for minorities, for women, for persons with disabilities, children and the elderly. So that intersectionality, if you like, of often race, gender, disability was another compounding factor. So it's a long-winded answer to say that there were a couple of different vectors. There were the substantive rights, there were equality rights questions, and then there were sort of the combination of different types of discrimination that were making this situation even worse.
And the United Nations and different actors have rolled out these 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And I'm curious how your work intersects with those goals and how you're acting to implement them.
Okay. So that goes a little bit beyond at least this specific analysis. I think, well, as many of you will know, the Sustainable Development Goals expand the remit of our ambition and the coverage of our development goals quite substantially compared with what was in the Millennium Development Goals. And in terms of substantive coverage, you see issues of economic and social rights, which were already quite well, or at least moderately well covered in the MDGs, being covered to a much greater extent in the SDGs. A second point is, though, that civil and political rights were all but neglected in the MDGs, and they are represented or reflected, at least in substance, to a far greater degree in the SDGs. And to that extent, the SDGs are a welcome advance. At a second level, you see principles, human rights principles, also far more represented in the SDGs. So considerations around participation or equality, inclusion, even accountability in terms of Goal 16, high in terms of the development goal priorities, and that's a good thing. Where I think the SDGs could be critiqued, if I may, and I think I'm on record as having said this, is if you were to take a human rights purist view and you were to really push hard and say, wait, where is human rights in terms of an explicit hook? Is there any recognition of human rights as the obligations of member states or of countries under international law? You'd have to say no. So there is, of course, as part of the overall framework of the future we now want, the General Assembly resolution does, of course, include a declaration which makes a handsome number of references to the Universal Declaration, to treaties, obligations, but when it comes to the goals, there is no reference to human rights. And so some of us have thought that this looks a little bit like the MDGs revisited. We had, of course, the experience of the Millennium Declaration laden with human rights references, and then the goals not mentioning them at all. So I think, to answer your question, it's sort of glass half full, half empty. I think there's a lot to welcome and applaud in the SDGs, but from a pure human rights perspective, some might say it was a missed opportunity.
Great, thank you. And building on another point you made, talking about how the connection between climate change and human rights is a relatively new idea. Based on my own research, I found that a lot of actors have pushed states to protect human rights that are affected by environmental degradation. So I was wondering if you could kind of connect the dots there and explain the differences between environmental degradation and climate impacts, and why now climate and the impacts it has on human rights is becoming more a part of the equation.
Okay, well, I think one of the things I think I can speak to maybe more than that is why the connection between human rights and climate change is a difficult one, notwithstanding being on the agenda, as you rightly say. It is true that with the various COPs that we've seen and the declarations that have come out around them, it's true that there's a much greater recognition of the problems, social and human, connected with climate change. I think looking at it from a public international law perspective, which is what we did in this study, the idea of bringing a human rights lens complicates things to some extent, because as human rights lawyers, we look for the protection of a right, but we also have to identify duties. So the rights are relatively easy to identify. The OHCHR study, so the study produced in 2009 by the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, does an excellent job of analysing specific rights that will be impacted, and also touches on all of the dimensions that I described earlier in terms of discrimination dimensions, as well as compounding factors, migrants, gender, disabilities, youth, and so on. But I think when it comes to duties, it's far more complicated because of the nature of the harm. The nature of the harm is diffuse, and the causality is also difficult to establish. So often you will have emissions from one country resulting in impacts in another. So the rights, yes, you can identify them in country B, but the responsibility, the obligation, that duty may not be of the government of country B. It may in fact be of country A. And John Knox has done an outstanding analysis of this and explained why it's complicated, because you're dealing with no longer a strict vertical relationship of state duty bearer and citizen rights holder, but now a diagonal relationship between a right holder in one country and perhaps the government of another. So this is very difficult legal terrain, I think.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And moving a little away from that, earlier you talked about not only how climate change, the impacts, rising sea levels, lots of populations moving affect human rights, but you also briefly mentioned how specific policies or changes we make could also affect human rights. And being someone who works on carbon pricing, which is on the surface can be regressive in nature, disproportionately affecting low-income people, vulnerable nations. How do you advocate to make sure our policies moving forward, or decisions the UN or any international bodies make, are actually lifting up the most vulnerable communities? Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, I'd still have to make the proviso, the caveat that I wasn't in this. We didn't advocate for anything in particular. So with that caveat, I think when it came to putting forward reasons for which human rights might be a useful tool legally or otherwise, I think the key question could be answered along two dimensions. The first is substantive. So human rights would provide you with substantive legal standards, a legal baseline to approach climate change. Again, as I said earlier, these impacts are not being felt in a vacuum. They are being felt by people who actually have rights under national and international law. So these are already protected rights. These are standards that exist already, protecting substantive rights, as I mentioned, the right to housing, to health, to food, water, and so on. But then human rights also provide human rights law also provides procedural standards. And I think that's maybe where the they may offer the greatest value in terms of new approaches to tackling this problem. The procedural standards might relate to the right to information, the right to be consulted, the right to participate, what are sometimes called Aarhus rights after the Aarhus Convention. And they may also demand that decisions, they may also impose certain standards for decision making. They may also require that decisions be made proportionately based on the right kinds of information and so on. The jurisprudence of the European Court of Human Rights is very instructive on this point, albeit not directly transferable to the kinds of questions we're dealing with regard to climate change. I think human rights law, as I mentioned earlier, shines a light, underscores the question of vulnerability. So it demands a focus on the most vulnerable, as rights-based approaches would. Also highlights the question or issues around non-discrimination. Interestingly, some have pointed to how human rights law points to the social and human impacts rather than treating it. I'm not sure the criticism can be made as much now, but in the past that climate change was dealt with in more technocratic terms without seeing the human face of suffering and the social and human impacts. I think finally, in terms of concrete tools, human rights law may also offer some tools. Increasingly, human rights law has stepped up to the plate a bit in terms of providing, focusing more on methodology. So an instrument like a human rights impact assessment, in addition to, say, an environmental impact assessment, for instance, that will allow you to use human rights law to help identify and locate where the harm is and to whom and to what extent. And also maybe point to the use of human rights indicators and the empirical side of this question. And overall, I think it's fair to say that human rights law really puts an emphasis on accountability, on transparency, and putting, if I may say, the blame somewhere. I mean, locating responsibility for these issues, even if legally and in purely legal terms, it's difficult to do.
Great, thank you. And I want to definitely touch on that transparency and accountability, so thank you for that. I wanted to move towards the recent international agreements, COP21, COP22, and I don't think Charles is going to be able to join us today, unfortunately, but I was wondering if you could talk to how COP21 and COP22 addressed the connections or didn't address the connections between climate change and human rights, and possibly talk about how it could be improved moving forward, as there is room to obviously strengthen that agreement down the road.
Okay. Well, I think I'd just like to limit myself to one point, which is that COP21 and its recognition of its explicit recognition of human rights came as a surprise to many of us, and I think it was a welcome development for sure. The fact that as many of you will know, the agreement in its preamble acknowledges that climate change is a common concern to humankind, but also states that parties should, when taking action to address climate change, respect, promote, and consider their respective human rights obligations, obligations on human rights, right to health, rights of indigenous peoples, local communities, migrants, and so on, was, I think, very significant. So going back to the three-part typology of conclusions that we drew here in this study, it fits in with that second one, which is that human rights obligations have a direct relevance and bearing, or should have a direct relevance and bearing on how states approach or respond to climate change.
Well, thank you. I thought that was a great summary. And now I wanted to move, because in addition to being a lawyer, you're also a professor. And being a student, I'm very interested in, if you could speak a little bit to the work and the things you cover in the classroom. And additionally, if you could talk to the advice that maybe a young person in the audience or watching us live, if they want to pursue environmental law, if they want to pursue international human rights, what advice do you have for them?
Okay. Well, thanks. Yeah, certainly teaching is a highlight of my year of commitments. I mean, it's one of the things that I enjoy the most in addition to work. I teach a course during the summer in American University on human rights and development. And what I try to focus on, it's a fairly condensed course, more seminar style, is helping students to understand how the world of development, which is, as many of you will know, defined more by high-level declarations, goals like the SDGs, and declarations or agendas that you might see coming out of aid effectiveness, on the one hand, with the world of human rights, which we understand in much more purely legal terms, with conventions, with treaties. So a big part of our running theme and a big part of the course is trying to understand how those two worlds come into contact, and where the points of convergence are, as well as why disconnects persist. The themes the reasons we come up with are diverse, and my classes will come up with different understandings about where the points of convergence are and why divergences persist. Sometimes it's about language and about the lack of a common language, with this world of development being more driven by or undertaken with a discourse of economics, where the world of human rights law is obviously dominated by legal discourse, by norms of international law, and I think a sense that world of human rights law is also focused on monitoring and accountability, which is true, but also naming and shaming, enforcement, violations, which of course is always a difficult discourse, but a particularly difficult when in I think a development context. What I try to leave my students with is a sense of the role of the human rights lawyer in this world, and the fact that the disconnects shouldn't dissuade them. That essentially public international law now is a very complex arena with many very elaborate and well-developed regulatory regimes governing different spheres, which are not very well connected. In fact, the disconnects are what you're most struck by when you start to analyze this. But it's still the same member states that are parties to these human rights agreements, as much as members of the boards of IFIs, or participating in trade, environment, or other regulatory regimes. So then that leads me to the question you asked, which is what do I advise students who ask me? I always advise them to find an area that they're really passionate about and to specialize, because to say you're a public international law or expert or international lawyer now doesn't mean what it might have meant 30 years ago. The fields have expanded exponentially and continue to. And each of these institutions, the bank included, has an elaborate system of policies and rules and procedures. And so you very quickly realize you have to master and understand the intricacies of this individual regulatory framework. So I think having an area of specialization, I say to read as much as you can and publish.
Well, thank you. That was great. Now I think we're going to move to more of a town hall session where we can answer your questions. So while you guys are thinking of those questions, I wanted to ask you about your story, how you got to where you're here today, and if you could spend a couple minutes on that journey, I think we'd all appreciate that.
Sure. So I began my studies in Ireland at Trinity College Dublin, where I did my undergraduate degree in law, and then went to Oxford and did a master's in human rights law, and then came to Harvard and went back to Oxford to do my PhD. So it was a long academic career, but I did follow the advice I've just given you, which is to stay very specialized on human rights law. I came to Washington in 2000 and worked for a short time at a law firm, and then had an opportunity to work here for the General Counsel on a really more research assignment on human rights. And that was in 2002, and I'm still here. So I have done other things, but that has definitely been a running theme, a running sort of thread throughout, is an interest in human rights law. What I have found is if you have an area like that and you really specialize, it can be applied in different contexts. I never thought of doing work on human rights law in development or in an IFI, but certainly the concepts were the same. The same treaties apply or should apply in all of these contexts, and they are the ones, they are still the reference points. So I didn't regret, at the time I regretted starting a PhD. I didn't regret having gone an academic route initially once it was done. Yeah.
Great, well thank you. And now we'll take some audience questions, if there are any. Yes.
Hi. My name is Pearl, and I do agree with you that human rights is a field that is essentially naming and shaming, so I like that phrase. Thank you. But I want to ask you and give you two examples of two countries that are on extreme sides of the scale. And we'll take the US on the one side, and we'll take Zimbabwe on the other side, both with human rights issues. So if we're saying a human right, a basic human right, is access to water, electricity, services, health, and so on, you know the current situation in Zimbabwe. If a regular person does not have access to that with its current human rights issues, how then can you even make this a reasonable realization for a regular individual? Mm-hmm. On the other end of the scale, you take the US. If we're talking about human rights and you mentioned the fact that states would have the ability to bring that and make it accessible to everybody, those are usually disseminated by departments of social services. Mm-hmm. So those people that don't have access to certain things, it is their human right, and then they get the help from departments of social services so that they have housing. So how do you make that real for that person, and how would that become a realization through departments of social services? Two different ends of the scale.
Yeah. Should I take this one and then maybe a group of them? I'd like to just quickly respond, though. I think it's a great point. Maybe just to clarify, I think it would be unfair to characterize human rights exclusively as naming and shaming. I think that maybe there is a place for that too, of course, and for monitoring and enforcement. But I think that at least my argument over the years has been that human rights can fulfill a very different programmatic role, and that can actually help you in terms of forward-looking strategies. I think the point that you alluded to and that I raised about COP21, about human rights having potential relevance to forward-looking strategies and responses to climate change, is one example of how I think we can look at human rights and human rights discourse in more positive terms. It may, of course, be there as a stick, but it may have other functions, and I think that may be equally, if not more, important in the development realm. The point you raise about how to make these rights a reality is the perennial one. We face it all the time. I mean, right now we're trying to unpack the concept of minimum core precisely to answer the point that you've raised. Because my colleagues here will ask me, well, look, this all sounds great on paper, but really, we're dealing with countries with, to take your Zimbabwe example, extreme resource constraints where recurrent costs, very basic recurrent costs can't be met. And you're telling us that this entire population has the right to X and Y. What we've tried to do is say, look, it's not that simple. You have concepts, as you know, like progressive realization that give you a margin, that give you time, and that recognize resource constraints. So the project, it isn't finished, but once it is, I think it would be useful for you and others to see this, that what we've tried to do is explain what human rights law says about reaching those goals in reality. It's not saying everybody must have access to X cubic feet of water every day. It's not saying that. It isn't that prescriptive, but it's suggesting that there might be roadmaps, and it also suggests that human rights law can help you to prioritize, given where you are in terms of, relative wealth or resources in the world. Question of the human rights situation in the US, I hear what you're saying, and what we figured out with minimum core was that we talk about human rights, including economic and social rights, as though it was a uniform standard that you could apply across the board without taking account of, the differences in resource and development of different countries, and also really without tackling the hard question of what do you do with a polity, with a culture that doesn't prioritize these rights in the first place. I don't have an answer for you, but I hope you'll follow our work, because we're trying to figure it out too.
Hello. Thank you so much. I'm very passionate about public international law matters. But you just said a minute ago that it looks like the human rights aspects of COPs 1 and COPs 2 may be very, very difficult to implement. And if eventually they're implemented, enforceability will be a problem. In that case, if I can identify the defendant the other way, a third-party state, don't you think I can sue that party in an international law court? That is, if I can identify a third-party state which violates my rights, for example, a case where oil is deposited in a third country, oil and other oil matters or oil rejects are deposited in a third country. It is not my country, but my rights are affected by this act. Don't I have the right to sue this identified defendant in an international court? Because from what you said, it was like, the rights are there, but it might be very difficult to identify the defendant, and then in that case, it's not enforceable. But I think there must be some disposition which allows parties, individuals, to sue a third-party state who is not necessarily their own state, but who has caused them some damage in that violating their human rights. Is there any provision that way in international public law?
Do you want me to take one at a time? Let me just, I wasn't suggesting that it was not possible to sue a country, say a third country. So what I was trying to say was that I think that there are a number of important legal obstacles to that kind of suit, and that I was also indicating that, or I think said that efforts to bring those kinds of suits had not been successful. They haven't even been successful in domestic contexts where it is a citizen suing his or her own government under domestic law. Even there, because of issues around questioning the very existence of climate change, plus the myriad of causality problems and proof. I think in the human rights context, the conclusion we came to, at least, and it's been a number of years, but I think it probably still holds, which is that you have a problem around the structure of human rights law itself doesn't really lend itself to tackling climate change. It wasn't conceived or designed to tackle those kinds of problems. And so in a way, what we're trying to do, or doing our best effort, is to take the essence of human rights law, the few key attributes that I mentioned, and saying that these could be used, in fact, to good effect. I'll tell you where we came out ultimately, but I think part of the problem is the structure of human rights law. Second, that yes, by its nature, it focuses on rights and obligations, and it doesn't lend itself well to obligations which are held by somebody other than the duty bearer, than your own state government. Because as you know, human rights law operates like a normal treaty between states, horizontally, but also vertically between the state and its citizens. Where it doesn't operate that clearly or that well is a suit taken by a citizen against another government. Even interstate disputes in human rights tribunals are very rare. So my point was that by its nature, human rights law doesn't really lend itself to pursuing this kind of claim. You have a problem with the forum. You have a problem of extraterritorial obligations or application, which is, as we all know, extremely complicated on its own without bringing it into the climate context. So yes, what we found was you could identify the rights affected. You could even identify rights that would be relevant to action by the state going forward, adaptation or even mitigation, but that the duty was really the hard area. Now, just where we came out was that in the end, somebody I admire immensely who's been very influential in this field is Mary Robinson. And we've had many discussions about this, and she's a lawyer's lawyer, and that's one of the many things I admire about her. Nevertheless, in this context, she focuses on climate justice. She doesn't get into the nitty-gritty of lawsuits and Inuit or whichever of these cases, as much as I'm sure she supported them. She talks about the unfairness, the points I made about disproportional impacts and justice. women's rights and how women's rights are disproportionately affected. So that's sort of where her points of emphasis were. And just to conclude, in the end, even though we weren't focused on advocacy in this study, I think we recognize that these arguments might be most useful or have greatest impact in terms of advocacy, actually. So.
I have a question to follow on to what you have just explained. So, is there a light at the end of the tunnel to fix the problem we apparently cannot fix? And is that map or that road, what is that pathway? Are we saying that we need civic groups to put pressure on governments so that we can change policy before the governments go and sit and decide on what these treaties are? What is that roadmap?
Okay, so I don't have the roadmap in my mind to share with you,
idea,
but
an idea.
What I wanted to say was that I think, and this is something that I leave my students with in terms of the broader discussion on human rights and development, which is that if you, as a public international lawyer, are aware of the tools that exist, for instance, in human rights law, and that if you take a more holistic and cohesive view of public international law, one that tries to tackle fragmentation and encourage policy coherence, so encourage joined-up thinking. That's, I think, certainly one part of the roadmap, one part of the solution going forward. What that means in concrete terms is that as you negotiate the next COP 22, 23, whatever, you have in the back of your mind that you, as a representative of whatever government, more than likely have human rights obligations, that they should inform the way in which you tackle the questions of climate change before you. And consider future generations. There are a whole host of ways in which human rights law can help you to focus, say, on the most vulnerable, on the most discriminated. As to the bigger question you've raised, again, I don't have the answer about the specific roadmap, and I think it's not. I think human rights law doesn't have it either. I mean, this is a problem that is likely to, these are problems likely to challenge the climate context on its own, much less bringing in human rights questions.
Hello, my name is Phil. The rate of homeless people per year is increasing. As the climate changes and the weather gets colder or warm, homeless shelters still get overcrowded. With that being said, homeless shelters still get overcrowded. How can you integrate human rights with climate change and help those left on the streets, as well as development and climate refugees?
Okay, well, a really important point. I think in each of the countries we looked at, and we were more focused admittedly on the macro, sort of the law that applies between countries. But when we did look within countries, I think the right to housing was probably, and shelter was probably the most immediate example that came out. I think it's, I think the best way to answer your question is that it's probably the one example that is the most compelling in terms of why climate change is a human rights issue. You mentioned homelessness and shelters, which may be more how it would be characterized here, but in terms of how we explain the plight of climate migrants, we use the human rights terminology precisely because it's the one that has currency, and the right to housing is exactly the frame that we use. And all the dimensions that apply to that have been developed over many years within the UN human rights system. One of the areas that we're working on at the moment is climate refugees, or what we've called climate refugees. And precisely because the existing framework of international law that applies to refugees would not cover somebody moving as a result of adverse weather or flooding or whatever, we've put forward an idea that you could, in fact, use human rights concepts and the right to housing and shelter as a way to find avenues to protect them, because there is this, as we all know, this massive legal gap. And what we see happening in Europe at the moment. While of course there are political dimensions, in many cases the migration problems do have their roots, in fact, in climate change. So really important point. And just to answer, the right to housing is probably the central case study, if you will, for explaining the link and for making sense of that link.
Well, great. Do we have any more questions? Okay, well, I think on behalf of all of us, I'd like to thank you, Siobhan, for joining us today. Your work is incredible, and I've had the honor of speaking with you here today, and you've answered a lot of questions I had. So thank you, and I'll give her a round of applause.